Place your two fingers gently on the inside of your wrist right now. Find your pulse. Feel it. Feel the rhythm of that beat, your heart pushing blood through thousands of miles of blood vessels while you sit here watching this. Now, I want you to keep your fingers right there for just a few more seconds, because what I'm about to tell you involves the exact blood vessels you are feeling right now, and the specific time of day when something damaging is happening to them that almost no one talks about. Stay with me. That pulse you just felt is your arteries doing their job, and most of the time they do it beautifully. But there is a window, a specific 2 to 3 hour window that opens every single morning when you first wake up, when your arteries become measurably more inflamed than at any other point in your 24-hour cycle. Not because something is wrong with you, not because you are sick, but because of a biological process that accelerates after the age of 60 in ways that the standard 10-minute checkup at your doctor's office almost never catches in time. And today I want to tell you about two foods, just two specific foods, that the research shows can begin to reverse that process at the cellular level. Not supplements, not drugs, actual foods that you may already have in your kitchen right now, used the wrong way or not used at all. I want to tell you about a patient of mine. Her name was Margaret. She was 73 years old, retired nurse from Michigan, sharp as anyone I have ever met in 30 years of medicine. She came to see me not because she felt terrible, but because she felt what she described as not quite right in the mornings. Her words. She told me that between 6 and 9 in the morning, she would sometimes feel a dull pressure across her chest, a heaviness in her neck, a slight blurring at the edge of her vision. Then by mid-morning it would lift. She had mentioned it to her previous doctor twice. Both times she had been told it was probably anxiety, maybe blood pressure variation, nothing alarming. They had not run an inflammatory panel. They had not asked what time she woke up, what she ate in the morning, or what her morning cortisol pattern looked like. When I ran a full morning inflammatory profile on Margaret, CRP drawn at 7 a.m., endothelin 1, interleukin 6, the numbers told a different story. Her arterial inflammation markers in the early morning hours were nearly 2.5 times higher than what we saw when we drew the same markers at 3 in the afternoon. She did not have a disease. She had a pattern. And that pattern, if left unaddressed for another 5 or 10 years, would have made her a statistical certainty for a cardiovascular event. What we changed for Margaret was not a medication regimen. It was two things she ate. And within 14 weeks, her morning inflammatory markers had dropped by a clinically meaningful amount. I will tell you exactly what those two things were in just a moment. My name is Dr. James Harlow. I have spent over 25 years in internal medicine with a specific clinical focus on the intersection of vascular aging, inflammation, and nutrition in adults over 60. What that means in practice is that I spend a great deal of my time looking at why the cardiovascular system behaves differently after 60 than it did at 40. And more importantly, what the peer-reviewed evidence tells us we can actually do about it with food, timing, and lifestyle. Before we go further, if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please take a moment right now and click that subscribe button. I want you to know why this matters today in particular. The next video I'm going to publish on this channel is one I have been wanting to make for months. It covers a silent muscle failure that affects 1 in 3 adults over the age of 60 and that almost no one discusses at their doctor's appointment. It is not about the heart. It is not about the brain. It is about a system in your body that loses function gradually, quietly, and with consequences that most people attribute to aging, when in fact they are entirely addressable with the right information. If you are subscribed, you will see that video the moment it goes up. If you are not, you will miss it. So subscribe now and let us get into today's topic. To understand why morning hours are uniquely dangerous for your arteries after 60, you need to understand two things that happen simultaneously when you wake up. The first is what researchers call the morning cortisol surge. Within the first 30 to 45 minutes of waking, your body releases a significant spike of cortisol, the same hormone that responds to stress. This is a normal biological event. Every human being experiences it. But cortisol is a pro-inflammatory molecule at high concentrations. It activates inflammatory pathways along the inner lining of your arteries, a delicate single-cell thick layer called the endothelium. In your 20s and 30s, your endothelium is resilient enough to handle that daily cortisol spike without lasting consequences. But by your 60s and 70s, years of cumulative damage, oxidative stress, and the natural decline in nitric oxide production have made that endothelial lining significantly more vulnerable. A study published in Hypertension by the American Heart Association documented that the morning surge in blood pressure, driven in part by this cortisol release, is independently associated with carotid atherosclerosis and markers of vascular inflammation, particularly in adults over 65. The second mechanism is circadian-driven leukocyte adhesion. Research published in Arteriosclerosis, Thrombosis, and Vascular Biology found that the adhesion of white blood cells to the inner walls of arteries follows a circadian rhythm, and that adhesion to arterial walls peaks in the morning hours, approximately 1.5 times higher than the baseline rate seen later in the day. What this means in plain language is that the cells responsible for arterial inflammation are more likely to stick to your artery walls in the morning than at any other time of day. In someone over 60, whose arterial walls already carry more plaque and more inflammatory burden than they did a decade ago, that daily morning peak in leukocyte adhesion is not a minor variation. It is a daily inflammatory event. A third layer comes from research published in Circulation Research, examining how the molecular clocks inside arterial cells regulate inflammatory gene expression. The genes responsible for producing inflammatory cytokines are at their highest transcriptional activity during the early morning circadian phase. Your arteries are, in a very literal sense, biologically programmed to be more inflammatory in the morning. That is not a design flaw, it is an ancient survival mechanism. But after 60, when arterial resilience has declined, it becomes a vulnerability that compounds over years. Now, here is what the research shows you can do about it. And specifically, here are the two foods. Food number 2 is fatty fish, and more precisely, the omega-3 fatty acids EPA and DHA found in sardines, mackerel, wild salmon, and herring. I want to be very precise here because the evidence on omega-3s and arterial inflammation is now substantial enough that it deserves more than a passing mention. A landmark umbrella meta-analysis published in 2022 in the journal Clinical Nutrition, reviewing data from hundreds of randomized controlled trials involving tens of thousands of participants, found that omega-3 supplementation significantly reduced 3 of the most important inflammatory markers measured in vascular medicine: C-reactive protein, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interleukin-6. What was particularly important for anyone in this audience is what the analysis found about age. The reduction in CRP, the primary marker of systemic arterial inflammation, was significantly greater in patients over the age of 55 than in younger participants. The anti-inflammatory effect of omega-3 fatty acids is not equal across age groups. It is actually more powerful in older adults. Let me say that again because it matters. The people who benefit the most from the anti-inflammatory effects of omega-3s are exactly the people watching this video right now. The mechanism is specific and worth understanding. EPA and DHA, the active forms of omega-3 found in fatty fish, are incorporated directly into the phospholipid membranes of your arterial cells. Once there, they compete with arachidonic acid, the precursor molecule that your body converts into inflammatory prostaglandins and leukotrienes. By displacing arachidonic acid at the membrane level, EPA and DHA effectively reduce the raw material your arterial cells need to generate the inflammatory signals that drive plaque formation and endothelial dysfunction. This is not a gentle effect. A study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition found that regular consumption of fatty fish 2 to 3 times per week was associated with significantly lower plasma concentrations of IL-6 and endothelin-1, 2 of the exact morning inflammatory markers that were elevated in Margaret's case. There is also a morning timing advantage to omega-3s most people are not aware of. EPA and DHA reach peak arterial tissue concentration within 3 to 5 hours of consumption, which means if you eat fatty fish at dinner, the EPA and DHA are at their highest concentration in your arterial tissue during the overnight and early morning hours, precisely when your arteries are under the greatest inflammatory pressure. You are not just eating for your health in a general sense. You are timing nutrition to counteract a specific biological vulnerability in a specific window. For practical purposes, the goal is 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish per week at minimum. Sardines are the most underestimated food in preventive cardiology. A single can of sardines in olive oil, and notice I said olive oil specifically, and you will understand why in a moment, provides nearly 2 grams of combined EPA and DHA, along with vitamin D and selenium, both of which have independent anti-inflammatory effects on vascular tissue. Wild salmon, mackerel, and herring are also excellent sources. The key is frequency and consistency, not massive single doses. If you have found something useful in this video so far, I want to ask you to do 2 things right now. First, leave a comment below and tell me, have you or someone you love noticed symptoms that are worse in the morning than later in the day? Pressure, heaviness, shortness of breath, or anything like that your doctor dismissed or attributed to something else? I want to know because that pattern is more medically significant than most people realize, and you deserve to understand it. Second, if you are not yet subscribed, click that button now. The next video on this channel covers a silent condition that affects 1 in 3 adults over 60 that almost no one discusses at their doctor's appointment. You will want to see it. Food number 1, the more powerful of the two and the one with the most specific evidence for morning arterial inflammation, is extra virgin olive oil. I want to distinguish very carefully here between extra virgin olive oil and other forms of olive oil because they are not equivalent. The anti-inflammatory properties I am about to describe are specific to extra virgin olive oil, cold-pressed, unrefined, high polyphenol. What makes extra virgin olive oil unique in the context of arterial inflammation is a compound called oleocanthal. Oleocanthal was identified by researchers studying why Southern European populations who consumed large quantities of fresh extra virgin olive oil had dramatically lower rates of cardiovascular inflammation. What they found is that oleocanthal inhibits the same enzyme pathway that ibuprofen inhibits, cyclooxygenase 1 and cyclooxygenase 2, the enzymes that produce the inflammatory prostaglandins driving arterial inflammation. The key difference is that ibuprofen works quickly and leaves the body in hours. Oleocanthal, consumed regularly, builds a sustained anti-inflammatory effect at the tissue level, including in the arterial wall, over days and weeks. A randomized controlled crossover trial published in Clinical Nutrition in 2023, the April study, found that participants who substituted their regular cooking oil with extra virgin olive oil rich in oleocanthal and a related compound called oleacine showed significantly improved oxidative stress markers and inflammatory status compared to participants using regular refined olive oil. The improvement was measurable in blood markers that directly reflect arterial inflammation. But the most powerful evidence comes from the PREDIMED trial, published and republished in the New England Journal of Medicine. PREDIMED enrolled over 7,000 participants aged 55 to 80 at high cardiovascular risk. Those assigned to a Mediterranean diet supplemented with extra virgin olive oil, roughly 4 tablespoons daily, had a 31% lower incidence of major cardiovascular events compared to a low-fat control group. The hazard ratio was 0.68. In plain terms, for every 100 people in the control group who experienced a heart attack, stroke, or cardiovascular death, only 68 in the olive oil group experienced the same. That is not a marginal benefit. It is a 31% reduction in your most serious cardiovascular outcomes, driven significantly by reduced arterial inflammation. The timing application for extra virgin olive oil is slightly different from omega-3s, and this is where Margaret's protocol became specific. The polyphenols in extra virgin olive oil, oleocanthal, hydroxytyrosol, and oleoropine, are absorbed most effectively when consumed with food and when the gut microbiome is most active. Research published in the journal Nutrients found that consuming extra virgin olive oil in the morning, drizzled over food, not heated to high temperatures, produces a measurable reduction in postprandial vascular inflammation, meaning the inflammatory spike your blood vessels experience after eating. In older adults, postprandial inflammation is a significant contributor to overall arterial inflammatory burden. Consuming extra virgin olive oil at the morning meal specifically addresses that window. Margaret's protocol was simple. Sardines or wild salmon twice per week at dinner. A tablespoon to 2 tablespoons of high-quality extra virgin olive oil every morning, over eggs, over whole grain toast, drizzled over a handful of leafy greens. Nothing exotic, nothing expensive in the context of what a cardiologist visit costs. Within 14 weeks, her morning CRP had dropped significantly. Her endothelin-1 levels had normalized, and she told me that the pressure and heaviness she had felt every morning for 2 years had largely disappeared. I want to talk about who is most at risk for severe morning arterial inflammation, because not everyone watching this is at equal risk, and I want you to understand where you fall. Adults over 70 have the highest baseline risk. As we age, the natural decline in nitric oxide production, the molecule your endothelial cells use to keep arteries relaxed and flexible, makes the morning inflammatory surge progressively more damaging. By age 70, nitric oxide bioavailability has declined significantly compared to age 50, which means the morning cortisol spike and leukocyte adhesion peak hit arteries that are already less protected. Individuals with type 2 diabetes or insulin resistance are in a particularly high-risk category for morning arterial inflammation. Elevated blood glucose amplifies the glycation of proteins in the arterial wall, creating additional sites for inflammatory cells to accumulate. The morning period, when glucose is often at its most variable, compounds the vascular inflammatory burden significantly. People with untreated or poorly controlled hypertension face elevated risk because the morning blood pressure surge, which in some individuals can be 20 to 30 points higher in systolic pressure than the baseline measured during the day, mechanically stresses the endothelial lining at precisely the moment when it is most biologically vulnerable to inflammation. Individuals who are sedentary, who smoke, or who have chronically poor sleep have profoundly dysregulated morning cortisol rhythms. Poor sleep in particular produces an exaggerated morning cortisol spike that amplifies both the inflammatory cascade and the morning blood pressure surge. If you are sleeping fewer than 6 hours per night consistently, your morning arterial inflammation is almost certainly higher than it would be with adequate sleep, regardless of what you eat. Those on corticosteroids for arthritis or asthma, or on diuretics that affect morning blood volume, should have a specific conversation with their physician about how those medications interact with the morning cardiovascular window. Let me give you the specific action protocol that I would discuss with a patient in my office. The first step is to shift your omega-3 consumption to the evening meal. If you are eating fatty fish 2 to 3 times per week, sardines, mackerel, salmon, herring, have those meals at dinner, not lunch. The pharmacokinetics of EPA and DHA mean that your arterial tissue will have the highest concentration of these anti-inflammatory fatty acids during the overnight and early morning hours, when you need them most. The second step is to make extra virgin olive oil a non-negotiable part of your morning meal every day. 1 to 2 tablespoons. Do not heat it to high temperatures. High heat degrades the polyphenols that provide the anti-inflammatory benefit. Use it raw or at low heat. Pour it over food. Dip whole grain bread in it. Add it to eggs after cooking. The specific amount that produced meaningful results in clinical trials was between 20 and 40 grams daily, roughly 1.5 to 3 tablespoons. Start with 1 tablespoon in the morning and 1 with your evening meal. The third step is to protect your sleep. I know that sounds disconnected from what we have been discussing, but it is not. Your sleep quality directly regulates your morning cortisol release, which is the primary trigger for morning arterial inflammation. 7 to 8 hours of consistent sleep reduces the cortisol spike, reduces leukocyte adhesion, and reduces the morning blood pressure surge. It is not optional in an anti-inflammatory protocol. The fourth step is to have your doctor draw a morning CRP, ideally at or before 8 a.m., along with your standard cholesterol panel. Most physicians draw blood mid-morning or later, which means they are consistently missing the peak of your inflammatory cycle. If you are over 60, ask specifically for a high-sensitivity CRP drawn early in the morning. That number will tell you far more about your actual arterial inflammatory burden than a cholesterol number drawn at noon. The fifth step is morning movement. Not strenuous exercise immediately upon waking. That can temporarily spike inflammation in already compromised arteries. But a 10 to 15-minute gentle walk within 45 minutes of waking significantly reduces the morning inflammatory cascade by promoting nitric oxide release through endothelial shear stress. The arteries respond to gentle movement by producing more of the very molecule that protects them from inflammation. This is one of the simplest and most evidence-supported interventions in cardiovascular medicine, and it costs nothing. Margaret still sends me a note every few months. She is 73 now, still teaching part-time. Her morning heaviness is gone. Her inflammatory markers are in range. She thinks about her arteries every morning when she pours her olive oil. That is the goal, not to be afraid of your body, but to understand it well enough to protect it. If this video gave you something worth sharing, send it right now to someone you care about. A spouse, a sibling, a parent, a friend who wakes up every morning never thinking about what their arteries are doing in that first hour. That information could matter to them more than you know. Subscribe to this channel if you are not already subscribed. The next video I am publishing covers a silent muscle failure that affects 1 in 3 adults over 60, something almost no one discusses at their regular doctor's appointment. Not about the heart, not about the brain, but about a system that loses function quietly and with consequences that are entirely addressable once you understand what is happening. You will not want to miss it. Leave me a comment below answering this specific question. What time do you typically wake up? And have you ever noticed that symptoms, pressure, stiffness, heaviness, breathlessness, tend to be worse in the first hour or two after waking and then improve as the day goes on? I read every single comment on this channel. That pattern, the one Margaret described as not quite right in the mornings, is not something to dismiss. It is your body trying to tell you something. I am Dr. James Harlow. Take care of your heart. I will see you in the next video.